A single diplomatic trip changed everything. In just days, a nation once viewed as peripheral began negotiating industrial and technological cooperation with a country known for decades of advanced systems and technical expertise. Why should this matter to you? And why is Ibrahim Traore at the center of it? Because what unfolded next made seasoned observers pause. You are about to hear an explanation many public briefings avoid stating directly, even though analysts quietly discuss it when assessing shifts in national strategy and influence. You will clearly understand the real strategic stakes behind this development. If someone stops here, they may assume this is just another diplomatic headline without lasting significance. That assumption can lead to a shallow reading of events and a false sense that nothing structural is changing. Without the deeper chain of context, it becomes easy to accept simplified interpretations shaped by surface narratives rather than underlying motives. Missing what comes next means missing why observers who track geopolitical positioning are paying closer attention than they openly admit. And why moments like this often signal shifts long before they become obvious to the wider world. What many observers expected quietly is true. This was not a routine diplomatic visit, but a signal of strategic repositioning. One appointment decision in March 2023 set the stage for what unfolded next. The chain began when leadership in Burkina Faso sought partners able to provide technical capacity rather than symbolic support. Attention turned toward countries with established industrial and scientific infrastructure, and that search eventually pointed toward Iran. A state known for decades of experience in manufacturing systems, engineering development, and applied technology sectors. The situation intensified when a senior military figure was entrusted with representing the country abroad, carrying not only formal authority but also the responsibility to explore cooperation that could influence national development pathways. The seriousness grew because this envoy was not randomly selected. He had first been appointed Chief of the Armed Forces General Staff, a role commanding the entire military structure, before later being elevated to Minister of Defense and Veterans Affairs and promoted to the rank of General. Those sequential decisions signaled a pattern of trust and long-term planning rather than improvisation. Observers who study leadership behavior often look for exactly this kind of personnel trajectory when evaluating whether a government is acting reactively or strategically. Under Ibrahim Traore, such appointments reflected a broader governing logic: place individuals in positions where loyalty, competence, and alignment with national objectives intersect. That approach matters because international negotiations often hinge less on formal policy documents and more on the credibility of the representatives sitting at the table. When Iran's president publicly expressed readiness to share knowledge, skills, and technical experience across sectors, the response from Burkina Faso's delegation emphasized determination for independence, development, and improved living standards. That exchange indicated alignment of interests, rather than symbolic diplomacy. Consider a brief real-world style scenario. A delegation enters a meeting expecting routine protocol statements. Instead, they encounter concrete offers of cooperation in technology transfer and industrial support. The tone shifts immediately. Conversations move from courtesy to calculation. Often marks the difference between ceremonial diplomacy and negotiations with structural implications. This is where Ibrahim Traore becomes central to understanding the trajectory, leadership decisions about whom to trust, when to engage, and which partnerships to pursue shape not just policy headlines but the long arc of national positioning. When those decisions occur in quick succession, analysts begin watching more closely because compressed timelines often signal deliberate strategy rather than coincidence. At this stage, a guiding figure emerges in the narrative, not as a symbol but as a practical interpreter of events: the defense minister entrusted with representing the country abroad. His credibility does not come from rhetoric alone, but from the sequence of responsibilities he has carried, moving from military command to national defense leadership. For observers, that progression signals institutional confidence rather than ceremonial appointment. And it provides a lens through which unfolding developments can be understood with greater clarity. During one key diplomatic encounter, he reportedly entered discussions prepared for formalities, yet left with substantive dialogue on technical cooperation. What began as protocol evolved into detailed exchanges about training, industrial capacity, and knowledge transfer. Yet analysts often regard them as early indicators that negotiations are moving beyond symbolism into operational territory. A second example reinforces that interpretation. When international partners publicly signal willingness to share expertise rather than merely offer statements of goodwill, it suggests they perceive seriousness and stability on the other side. Countries typically reserve meaningful cooperation proposals for counterparts they believe can implement them. That reaction, more than any speech, reflects external confidence in internal direction. Viewed together, these signals form a pattern rather than isolated incidents. They suggest that what appears outwardly as routine diplomacy may actually represent coordinated positioning designed to reshape long-term capacity and leverage. From that point, nothing looked minor anymore. First came the appointment. Then came the signal. Before the diplomatic outreach, Burkina Faso's international posture was largely defined by dependence patterns and limited industrial leverage. After the leadership reshuffle and consolidation of military authority, the tone shifted. The change was subtle at first, then it accelerated. The trigger phase began with personnel decisions. A chief of the general staff was appointed in March 2023. Authority centralized. Command structures aligned. Months later, in December 2024, that same figure was elevated to Minister of Defense and Veterans Affairs and promoted to a higher rank. Trust was reinforced. Responsibility expanded. The message was internal before it became external. Loyalty and strategic alignment mattered. Then, the external move happened. A trip to Iran. It did not unfold as a ceremonial visit. It unfolded as a strategic exploration. Meetings were held with senior leadership. Offers were discussed across sectors: industrial modernization, manufacturing systems, technology transfer, training programs. The conversation moved beyond pleasantries. It entered substance. That was the pivot. The escalation phase followed quickly. Public statements emphasized independence, determination, refusal to remain passive. When such language is paired with concrete discussions about industrial cooperation, analysts begin recalculating assumptions. A West African nation was no longer framed solely as a recipient of aid. Reactions rippled outward. Regional observers took note. Policy analysts adjusted their briefs. Questions emerged about long-term implications. Would technology transfer reduce reliance on imports? Could training programs build domestic engineering capacity? Would joint industrial projects diversify the economy beyond traditional sectors? Each possibility expanded the scope. Meanwhile, the domestic narrative tightened. The emphasis on sovereignty and institutional strength had been consistent. Now it appeared linked to external engagement. The sequencing mattered. First, internal consolidation. Then international negotiation. That order suggested planning rather than improvisation. The aftershock phase began quietly. No dramatic announcements. No sweeping declarations. Instead, incremental acknowledgement that something structural might be forming. Industrial advancement was discussed as a realistic objective rather than distant aspiration. Human capital development was framed as a strategic necessity. Economic diversification entered the conversation with renewed urgency. Yet tension remained. Every partnership carries risk. Every alignment reshapes leverage. Observers understood that cooperation with technologically experienced states could accelerate modernization, but it could also introduce geopolitical balancing challenges. Benefits on one side, exposure on the other. Still, the direction was unmistakable. Burkina Faso was signaling that it would not wait for change to arrive. It would seek it. It would negotiate it. And when leadership rhetoric about independence converges with concrete diplomatic initiatives, the timeline stops looking accidental. It begins to look intentional. By the time the dust settled from that sequence of appointments, promotions, meetings, and public declarations, the narrative had shifted. What once appeared as isolated events now resembled coordinated steps within a broader strategic repositioning. And the story was only entering its most measurable phase. Up to this point, the movement felt political. Now it becomes measurable. Before the outreach, Burkina Faso's industrial base relied heavily on imported machinery and external technical expertise. The conversation shifted toward technology transfer and local capacity building. That is the baseline to dealt a transition analysts track closely. The first quantitative anchor concerns scale. Discussions centered on cooperation across multiple sectors: technology, industrial manufacturing, energy systems, and training programs. That breadth matters. A multi-sector framework signals structural ambition rather than isolated pilot projects. It suggests intent to influence the wider production ecosystem, not just one niche industry. The second anchor relates to timeline compression. Within roughly 21 months from March 2023 to December 2024, the same scene, your figure moved from military chief of staff to defense minister and then engaged in international negotiation at a high level. That speed is significant. Rapid institutional consolidation often indicates synchronized strategy rather than gradual drift. Compressed timelines frequently correlate with deliberate repositioning. The third anchor concerns human capital. Public statements referenced knowledge sharing and advanced technical training for potentially thousands of citizens in engineering and industrial skills, even without exact enrollment figures. The scale implication is clear. Training at that magnitude can reshape workforce capability over time. It moves development from rhetoric to skill acquisition, from aspiration to operational competence. Each of these anchors connects back to Ibrahim Traoré's governing approach. Personnel appointments created institutional alignment. Institutional alignment enabled coherent negotiation. Coherent negotiation opened pathways for technology and training discussions. When examined sequentially, the numbers are not random data points, they represent stages in a structured process. The weight of this becomes clearer when reframed. Industrial modernization reduces reliance on imports. Technical training reduces dependence on foreign specialists. Diversification reduces exposure to single-sector vulnerability. Each shift strengthens internal resilience. Together, they compound. Yet numbers alone do not guarantee success. Implementation determines outcome. Technology transfer requires infrastructure readiness. Training programs require absorption capacity. Joint projects require regulatory clarity and sustained coordination. Without follow-through, metrics remain potential rather than progress. Still, the measurable indicators point in one direction: intent to move from symbolic independence to functional independence. That transition carries far greater consequences than a single diplomatic headline. The implications now demand a more balanced examination, and their concerns deserve serious attention. One opposing view argues that partnerships with technologically advanced but geopolitically controversial states could expose Burkina Faso to diplomatic pressure from other global actors. From this perspective, deepening cooperation might complicate relationships with Western institutions or regional alliances. International alignment often creates trade-offs. However, the counterpoint rests on agency. Sovereign states regularly diversify partnerships to avoid over-reliance on any single bloc. Engaging one partner does not automatically sever others, it can expand negotiating leverage if managed strategically. A second critique focuses on feasibility. Skeptics question whether Burkina Faso possesses a sufficient infrastructure, technical readiness, and institutional stability to absorb advanced technology transfers effectively. They argue that without strong regulatory frameworks and sustained investment, ambitious agreements risk remaining symbolic. Industrial modernization requires coordination, financing, and governance capacity, yet it overlooks a critical dimension: sequencing. Appointing trusted leadership, consolidating defense oversight, and publicly emphasizing training suggests that preparation may be unfolding alongside negotiation. Capacity is not static, it can be built incrementally. When both perspectives are placed side by side, a more nuanced picture emerges. Risk exists. Implementation challenges are real, but dismissing the strategy outright ignores the deliberate steps already visible. Ibrahim Traoré's approach appears rooted in institutional alignment first, external engagement second. That order matters in risk management. Balanced analysis does not require choosing sides. It requires recognizing both opportunity and constraint. In that tension lies the true strategic test. And the next development shifts the frame again. What changed the interpretation was not another announcement, but the realization that this cooperation discussion was never only about industry. It quietly reframed how observers understood the country's strategic trajectory. The outreach signaled an attempt to reposition nationally, not just economically. Until that point, many analysts had evaluated the situation through a narrow development lens. Technology transfer meant factories. Infrastructure meant growth. But once the broader implications surfaced, a deeper layer became visible. Industrial capability is not only an economic asset, it is also strategic leverage. Countries that build internal production systems gain more room to maneuver diplomatically because they rely less on external supply chains. This is why Ibrahim Traoré's role suddenly appeared in a different light to outside observers. His decisions were no longer interpreted simply as domestic governance moves. They began to look like pieces of a longer arc aimed at strengthening autonomy. That shift in interpretation matters because perception shapes international response. When other states believe a country is increasing its self-sufficiency, they adjust policy, investment, and engagement strategies accordingly. The practical impact of that realization is subtle but powerful. Conversations change tone. Partnerships become more calculated. What once seemed like a routine bilateral exchange starts to resemble a signal that a nation intends to renegotiate its place within regional and global systems. And once that door opens, the story rarely moves backward. The shift did not stay confined to meeting rooms or policy briefings. It began to register in tangible layers of reality, where consequences are measured not in statements but in effects. What started as a strategic signal gradually translated into pressures and opportunities across multiple sectors. And the ripple pattern reveals who stands to gain, who must adapt, and who feels the strain first. At the state level, decision-makers face heightened expectations when leadership signals ambition for industrial growth and technological advancement. It implicitly commits institutions to deliver results. That raises pressure on ministries to coordinate policy, infrastructure planning and regulatory frameworks fast enough to match diplomatic momentum. Even without precise budget figures, the pattern is clear. Strategic outreach increases both opportunity and accountability. Governments that initiate such moves must demonstrate capacity or risk credibility gaps. Businesses encounter a different reality. The prospect of new machinery, technical knowledge, and joint industrial projects can mean expanded production potential and market competitiveness. Yet opportunity arrives with adjustment costs. Companies may need to retrain workers, upgrade facilities, or adapt to new standards introduced through international cooperation. The signal is equally significant. A country seeking technological partnerships may be repositioning itself as a future manufacturing or processing hub rather than a purely resource-dependent economy. For ordinary citizens, the implications become most visible in daily life. Training initiatives in engineering, science, and technical trades suggest pathways towards skilled employment rather than informal or subsistence work. Even the expectation of such programs can shift public sentiment because it signals that development is being pursued through capacity building rather than short-term aid. When populations believe skills will translate into opportunity, social confidence often rises alongside economic prospects. Beyond national borders, regional observers begin recalibrating their assessments. Neighboring states watch closely when one country signals intent to diversify partnerships and strengthen internal production. Diplomatic alignments and competitive positioning. International actors also adjust their stance, since any sign of growing autonomy affects negotiation dynamics across multiple domains. Taken together, these layers show that the consequences are not abstract. They extend from government offices to factory floors, from classrooms to regional strategy rooms. What began as a diplomatic initiative now touches governance, commerce, livelihoods, and geopolitics simultaneously. At that point, the question is no longer whether change is happening. It is how far it could go. The most probable path forward is neither dramatic transformation nor sudden collapse, but a gradual recalibration shaped by pacing and execution. If current patterns continue, Burkina Faso is likely to deepen selective partnerships while cautiously strengthening internal capacity. With modest industrial gains, incremental workforce development, and periodic diplomatic balancing, Ibrahim Traoré's strategy produces visible but measured shifts rather than overnight breakthroughs, and stability depends largely on implementation discipline. A more optimistic outcome becomes plausible if coordination aligns across institutions, investment flows remain consistent, and training initiatives translate into a skilled technical workforce. Under those conditions, early cooperation agreements could evolve into sustained industrial ecosystems. Reliance on imports could decline, and the country's bargaining position internationally would strengthen. Such a trajectory would not be effortless, but it would demonstrate how deliberate sequencing of leadership decisions and external engagement can compound into long-term structural advantage. The most difficult scenario emerges if execution falters. Delays in infrastructure, administrative bottlenecks, or external pressure could slow momentum and weaken confidence among partners and investors. In that case, expectations would outpace results, and initiatives framed as strategic breakthroughs might be reinterpreted as overreach. The outcome would not be predetermined in decline, but it would narrow available options and increase the cost of adjustment. The key insight is not predicting which scenario will occur. It is recognizing that each remains possible at the same time. Strategic awareness comes from tracking signals early, understanding direction, and preparing for multiple paths rather than betting on only one. Because the future is shaped less by forecasts than by decisions made next. Now the lens turns inward, toward the person watching and listening. And consequences, the most important question is no longer about diplomacy or strategy alone. It is about what this evolving situation means for you, the observer trying to make sense of a rapidly shifting world. Some viewers belong to a group that actively tracks global developments. They read reports, compare sources, and analyze patterns. For them, understanding moves associated with figures like Ibrahim Traore offers an informational advantage. Awareness allows them to anticipate shifts before they become obvious headlines. Vigilance matters because fast-changing geopolitical environments can overturn assumptions quickly. Staying informed is not a what-I'm act, but an ongoing discipline. Others fall into a second group. Those indirectly affected. They may not follow every diplomatic detail, yet their work, finances, or opportunities can still be influenced by international economic shifts. Changes in trade routes, investment flows, or industrial development can reshape job markets and business conditions far beyond national borders. For them, awareness is a form of preparation. Understanding trends early can reduce uncertainty later. A third group might feel detached. Assuming such developments are distant or irrelevant, that reaction is understandable. Global strategy can seem abstract when daily responsibilities demand attention. Distance does not always mean immunity. Structural changes often become visible only after they begin affecting everyday life. By then, adaptation becomes harder. No matter which group someone belongs to, insight offers one shared benefit: it prevents being caught off guard. They must become actions tied to responsibility, timing, and proof. Once a country signals ambition for structural change, the real test begins with execution. So what would a practical path forward actually look like if momentum is to translate into measurable results? First comes the leadership level. National decision makers would need to define clear priority sectors for cooperation, establish implementation timelines, and track progress through visible indicators such as operational facilities, trained specialists, or functioning joint projects. Success would be measured not by announcements but by outputs people can point to. Under a framework shaped by Ibrahim Traore, this stage depends on whether strategic intent is matched with administrative precision within a defined period rather than open-ended plans. Second comes the institutional and business layer. Organizations responsible for industry, education, and infrastructure would have to coordinate so that external partnerships connect directly to domestic capacity. Facilities must be ready before technology arrives. Progress here could be measured through workforce placement rates, production increases, or reductions in technical import reliance. Without that alignment, even well-designed agreements risk losing momentum. Third comes the citizen level. Individuals play a quieter but decisive role by participating in training opportunities, adapting skills, and supporting long-term development initiatives. This step does not require grand gestures. It requires consistent engagement. Its success can be measured through enrollment numbers, certification completion, and employment transitions into skilled sectors. If needed, a fourth layer extends outward to regional and international cooperation, where transparent communication and balanced diplomacy help maintain stability while new partnerships form. That dimension can be assessed through sustained agreements rather than short-term statements. Implementation determines everything. Plans shape direction, but execution shapes reality. And the future ultimately depends on whether steps like these move from intention to action. We saw how a single appointment set events in motion and how a diplomatic meeting shifted perception. Now, returning to that moment provides perspective. It symbolized a decision to carry national ambition onto a wider stage. From the initial consolidation of leadership to international outreach, the journey followed a deliberate arc. What began as institutional alignment evolved into strategic engagement. Along the way, questions of risk, capacity, and consequence surfaced. Each layer added depth. Each phase clarified that this was more than a passing headline. In that progression, Ibrahim Traore emerged not as a distant figure, but as a central actor shaping direction through appointments, sequencing, and public positioning. Whether one views the approach with optimism or caution, the narrative reveals intent. It reflects a willingness to redefine posture rather than remain reactive. This story, then, is not solely about industry or diplomacy. It is about how leadership decisions can influence the trajectory of a nation seeking autonomy and development within a complex global landscape. And from here, responsibility extends beyond one office. Direction is chosen, not inherited. Moments like this rarely belong to one nation alone. A different interpretation and a different question about what it all means. That is what makes conversations about global change worth having. They do not end when the story ends. They expand when people begin reflecting on them. If you feel this account sheds light on a development more people should understand, passing it along can help widen awareness, so others also see the forces shaping events beneath the surface. Discussion deepens and thoughtful dialogue becomes possible. That kind of exchange is how informed communities take shape. You might see this story as a sign of strategic evolution. Someone else might see it as a calculated risk. Another viewer may interpret it as a lesson in leadership and timing. Each perspective adds something valuable to the conversation, because understanding grows when ideas meet rather than when they remain separate. So the most interesting question now is not what the narrator thinks. It is what you think comes next.